Dagda Yves agus tá fáilte roh is mis an Skelly Biog. Hello and you're very welcome. I'm the little storyteller and this is Patreon Insider. We have hit the mid of the month and that means it's audio recording time for those of you who are on that level over at patreon.com/Dagda, which is where I generate the brand new stories every month and the written stories, and then also the mid-month there's the audio recordings of me telling my stories, the ones I wrote. The story we have today is called Queen of the Muicíns, and I wrote it in 2019. And it is, as usual, inspired by Irish folklore, Irish lore, the deities that, as an Irish pagan, I work for and enjoy and work with, or maybe not work with, but actually have love and respect for, because sometimes that you need to be clear about that. Um, so yeah, the story is called Queen of the Muicíns, and the reason why I love writing these stories is that there are places still in Ireland, on the landscape of the island itself, where these stories physically connect you. Like the references to the Hill of Tara, like, and so many of the stories of the Hill of Tara, Queen Maeve gathering all of her troops at Rathcroghan, you can go to Rathcroghan. But there's also other small kind of locations, small off the beaten track areas, and that are still referenced in the stories and have very big impacts on the landscape and on the narrative of our ancient lore. So the inspiration from this story comes from the Ulster cycle. So all of the Irish mythology and lore is broken through these vast collection of stories written down by the early Christian monks, in many cases very faithfully, which we're very grateful for. There is bias here and there, but sometimes that bias is overtly written in as an extra line. It's like an annotated because they're demons, which is like, yeah, okay, but at least you kept the main narrative solid. So the sections of these stories are kind of generally gathered into what's known as the mythological cycle, where we find the Tuatha Dé Danann mostly. We then have the Ulster cycle and the Fenian cycle, which deal with the kind of warrior tribes, the Iron Age kind of, it's believed possibly Iron Age circumstances, where in the Ulster cycle we find Queen Maeve, Cuchulainn. During the Fenian cycle, you've got Fionnmachúil and the Fianna, as well as the other kind of like gods and kings still showing up down the line. And then the later cycle is the cycle of kings, which leads into the more actual history. So the inspiration for this story, Queen of the Muicíns, comes from the Ulster cycle. I mentioned Queen Maeve. It's well known that she was Queen of Connacht, and the whole Ulster cycle, the big kind of narrative that happens there is, of course, the Táin Cúailnge, which is the conflict between Ulster and Connacht over the two bulls, the white bull and the brown bull. But there are so many other stories in that same cycle. There's Fled Brickrew, which I never say right. It's the Feast of Brickrew, which is a lovely example of the cultural influences and cultural impacts as these kind of heroes from different kind of areas gather together. And Brickrew is 100% a trickster. Not trickster god trickster. He's just like he likes to just stir the pot and see what happens. Really, really fun stories. But of course, the section that we're looking at is actually just a small reference. It's a small reference to some of the actions of Queen Maeve in Rathcroghan and Connacht. The Rathcroghan complex includes famously the Cave of Cats, Ovnagach, and this cave is said to be an access into the other world, the Irish other world. And from this cave, there's a number of different things that come from the other world into our world to kind of cause chaos, to cause kind of harm or destruction, but also maybe to remind us of the power of the other world when we're not being in right relationship or right balance. And one of those, like the first is Ellen Treacian, this kind of three-headed fire-breathing monster that comes out, who is beaten by a bard. Amergin, the poet, actually beats Imogen. Uh, Amergin the poet beats Ellen Treacian, and then is Connacht is ravaged by a plague of birds. These birds kind of fly out of the cave and they breathe on all of the crops and it causes a pestilence and a famine. But the third, and this is the interesting one for me, is boars. It says that these massive kind of demonic, almost monstrous boars come out of the cave and they root around and they tear up the landscape and they wreck and ruin Connacht. And it says that it takes 7 years for that area, for the whole landscape to be recovered. one of the things, as I said, I really love about this is that there's a section of the landscape. Now, it's in private property. It's not covered in the tour guides. If you go to Tulsk in Roscommon, there's a heritage centre there who can take you on a Rathcrohan tour. You can go and see the mounds in Rathcrohan, which is Queen Maeve's kind of stomping grounds. You can go to the private land, which is the Cave of the Cats, with a tour guide, because again, a lot of these things are on private land and only registered tour guides have permission to access. But there's one that there's one other notable piece of topography in that area, which again is in private land. It's not something on many main tours, not something that can be accessed, but it's known as the Mucklocks. And it's this segment just south and southwestish of the cave itself is all of this tossed land. It's all like, up and down and kind of turned up ground. And, the grass is still very scrub there. It's this kind of long, like kind of furrowed field of just tossed earth. And it's called the Mucklocks. And the Irish word for pig or boar is muck. And so this is a direct reference to this story of these pigs, these otherworldly boars coming out and wrecking the land. So this is like the area that was destroyed that still exists today as we kind of recognize or remember the impact of these creatures on our world. So that's kind of where this story comes from. So it's this idea of these boars coming out. And it's said in the actual lore that the boars can't be counted. And so whether there's so many of them that they're uncountable, or whether or not it's some otherworldly influence, which means that you can't actually keep the boars in your eye line long enough to keep counting them. Maeve herself is summoned to deal with the boar issue, because Maeve, in many ways, is an initiate of the other world. She is like a druid in many of her functions, and Olive a judge. It's her who goes into the Cave of Cats to bring out the stone-headed cats for the later conflict with the three Ulster heroes to prove their worth. But it's in this instance she's summoned to deal with these pigs. And it's almost because of her training, because of her insight, and because of her right relationship with the other world, she can count them. She can see what's going on. And it says that one of them tries to actually jump over her on her chariot, and she reaches up and grabs it, and its skin rips off. Its outer skin rips off, but the boar is unharmed, and it still runs away. So in essence, Maeve then has to figure out what the balance is, and the boar are gotten rid of, but the impact on the landscape is still there. And it says, again, it takes 7 years for Connacht to be restored from the harm that was done to it. So it's that kind of small segment of lore that really inspired this story. Because as much as these boars are said to come from the Cave of the Cats or Uvnagach is also said to be the fit abode of the Morrigan, who is Ireland's goddess of poetry, battle, prophecy, and, in many cases, all-around awesomeness. Now, this is where, as I said earlier, it's important to say who you work for and who you don't. I have honor and love and respect for the Morrigan. I don't work for her. I live with someone who does work for her, and she offered me a job once. I said, thanks, but no thanks. I work for the Dagda. With great God comes great responsibility. That's the God I work for. But I love and honor and respect the Morrigan in my own ways as well. So this kind of crossover where it's the Morrigan's cave, it's the Morrigan's territory to access the other world, but you also then have these boars coming out of this Morrigan's cave. It just tickled me a heck of a lot. And some part of my brain just loved the idea that they're her boars. They're her kind of creatures that, are again sent out from the other world to remind us to maintain our honest relationships, to stay just, and to stay in right relationship with our neighbors, our good neighbors in many cases. So it's not kind of that inspires the story, and it's the Morrigan dealing with her boars. And again, I sent the Irish word for pig or boar is muck. One of these other things that I really love in our language is, in order to add a diminutive to something, you use the addition "in," so it's ifada n at the end. Now, generally, the diminutive is more along the lines of, something that's cute, or like, small, or like, oh, it's so kind of like, oh, as opposed to demeaning someone, to kind of like demean someone down. It's a diminutive in order to express an affection in certain ways. So it's an affectation. And so if my name is John, so Oscuelga in Irish, that's Sean. But if you're to like call me Cute John or Little John, it'd be Shawneen, you know. So that would be that kind of cute affectation of it. So that's where I've taken this idea of these monstrous creatures, but then put the Ian on it. So they're these Muck Ians, and they're her Muck Ians. So the story I have for those who are over there, it's the written story has been available for the other patrons there for a while. It's called Queen of the Muck Ians. It is a Morrigan story about her and her boars. But also, you know, I wouldn't be a Dagda bird if there wasn't a bit of Dagda in the story. And maybe we have an answer as to how the boars got out of her cave in the first place. Or maybe it's all just an amazing, entertaining story that, you know, I'm very, very passionate about. I'm very, very grateful to be able to share. So, as ever, Gaurav Mila Mahagas, thank you very, very much for all of you patrons supporting me. All of you here on YouTube who are kind of, like, you know, watching these videos, liking, subscribing. I absolutely really appreciate it. I love reading the comments as well and kind of connecting with them there too, because hey, you know, you can't exactly be a storyteller and a bard if you don't have someone to tell their stories to. And in our world of virtual connectivity, the only way I know or can read the influence of my stories on the crowd is in the comments or in the likes. So thank you very much for everything you do. Thank you very much for being here with me. And until next time, take care of yourself and slán go fóill. Goodbye.